How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Gianluca and I am a final year medical student studying in Canada. Today's video is going to be all about medical student debt, medical student loans. These are questions that I get extremely often, so I'm not going to delay the start of this video anymore. We're going to get right into it. In today's video, we're going to be going over the cost of medical school here in Canada, the cost of medical school down in the States for international programs, and then why there's such a big difference between all these different places in terms of how crazy expensive it is to actually be in medical school. Then we'll go over how any of us could even afford the cost of medical school. And finally, the last part of the video will be me trying to tally up just how much money I'm going to end up owing the government by the end of this year when I graduate. We'll go through all of my medical school expenses so far, so grab the popcorn for those of you that are interested. The timestamps will be in the description below, just like always. And if you guys want to help me get more of these videos out in the future, all you need to do is smash the like button. It's super easy, but just like that, we'll get started. We're gonna start with some coffee because I'm just outside of a shift right now. Give me 1 second and now we're gonna get started. Now, observation number one, the American medical schools. As per the most recent data that I could find, it seems that the average American medical student will have accumulated about $232,000 solely in medical school debt after completion of a 4-year traditional medical school degree. Now, if that wasn't shocking enough, another really interesting observation is that if you look at the data for the last 2 years, one of the things that you could see is that the average cost of medical school tuition seems to have doubled in only about the last 15 to 20 years, which is absolutely crazy. Now, one of the most interesting things about the American medical schools in terms of tuition, especially to me as a Canadian student, is just how different the schools are in terms of how much tuition costs. Whereas some of the top tier Ivy schools could expect students to pay $60,000 or more American dollars every single year just in tuition, you could also get a medical education from an in-state school that's a lot less expensive. Now, we could directly contrast this number to the Canadian medical schools, which on average, and speaking from experience, tend to be somewhere around 20 to 25,000 Canadian dollars per year in tuition. And definitely this is going to vary across the different schools in the country. It seems to me like some of the more expensive medical schools tend to be centered around the Ontario programs, and as always, the 3-year programs are going to be less expensive than the 4-year programs just because you're paying for less years of tuition with a 3-year program, which is actually really nice as someone that goes to a 3-year program. Now, as we can see, there is a big difference in the cost between medical school down in the States and medical school here in Canada. And a few years ago, when I first learned about this back in undergrad, I didn't really know what to make of this large discrepancy in price. But then when you look into it a little bit more, you see that the reason why medical school here in Canada is so much less expensive than down in the States is because here in Canada, higher education is often heavily subsidized by the government, which means that every single year, the amount of money that I pay in tuition, roughly about 25,000 Canadian dollars on average, doesn't even necessarily entirely cover the expenses that it would cost to educate me for 1 year as a medical student. And the remainder of my education is paid for, in this case, by the government. And then finally, we could go ahead and contrast both the American and Canadian costs of tuition for medical school directly to some of the international programs. And the one that I always use is SGU down in the Caribbean because they are very transparent with the way that they charge their students, and the entire breakdown is found on their website. On average, for a 4-year degree from down in the Caribbean from SGU, you're looking at somewhere around 320,000 American dollars for the entire education. Now, in this case, it's really hard for me to know just why it is so much more expensive to go down to medical school in the Caribbean for the tuition cost anyways, because there are other costs that we could talk about in a second. But in addition to the fact that the Caribbean universities, for the most part, are not subsidized by the government, you also have to contend with the fact that there might be some higher administrative fees and also other fees associated with paying the staff that have to leave the mainland to work on an island. But again, that's probably just my best educated guess in this case. And then in addition to all of that, there's also the fact that the majority of the programs down in the Caribbean and a lot of the international programs as well tend to be for-profit institutions, which is probably another reason why tuition tends to be a little bit more expensive. So where do we stand now? Just the cost of tuition for your medical school education is going to run you upwards of $100,000 no matter which way you slice it. But as I'm sure a lot of you know, it doesn't stop there. And depending on where you live, there are a variety of other living expenses that you're gonna have to pay as well. Some places more expensive than others. And just because I know the Toronto area, that's where I grew up, I'm a Canadian student, we'll use the University of Toronto's official statistics on their website, which shows that in addition to their tuition cost, for their first year students, they're probably gonna be expected to pay another $20,000 on average in additional living costs just for that first year. And that'll include things like the cost of rent, the cost of equipment and books, the cost of food, the cost of gas, doing anything fun at all, paying for your phone. Things add up very, very quickly, and I'd say just from experience that about 15 to 20,000 Canadian dollars is actually being pretty conservative in terms of living expenses for the year. Now here's the part where things get scary, and especially as a student, I mean, best case scenario, you're a Canadian medical student, you owe hundreds of thousands of dollars for tuition and the cost of living, and the reality is that most of us do not have access to hundreds of thousands of dollars just on the fly, straight out of undergrad. So what you need to do in order to pay for this tuition is take out a loan from a bank, open up what's known as a line of credit, for those of you that have never heard of such a thing before, which basically means that you will have access to money which is not yours, but you will use to pay for things that you cannot afford, which is a very dangerous situation, especially for students that have never had access to any real amounts of money before. The reason why this is dangerous is because the bank is not going to be giving you money for free. They need something out of this transaction, and what that means is that they will be charging you interest on all of the money that you spend. The problem is there is some money that you have no choice but to spend, and then there are also horror stories of students that end up taking out money that is supposed to be meant for student payments and for loans and other things like that, and spending it on things like a new car and a whole bunch of other things, basically taking out money that is then being charged interest, which will vary depending on, once again, where you're going for school. So here in Canada, the interest rate that I am paying right now for my student loans is about 2.2%. So that's the prime rate in Canada minus a quarter. Down in the States, I hear that it could range between anywhere between 4.5 to about 6.5%. And then down for the international medical schools, depending on what private lender you could find, because a lot of those loans will not be federal loans. A lot of students will actually need to go ahead and find a private lender in that case. Interest rates could be as high as up to 10% in some cases, which is really crazy. So the real horror stories that you come across on Reddit and places like the Dave Ramsey show are instances where students will go down to the Caribbean, end up in, let's say, $500,000 American between their student loans and the cost of living and everything else that they had to do throughout their 4 years of medical education and then undergrad that came before that, and then afterwards not be able to match into residency after being so much in debt, with up to a 7 to 10% interest rate in some cases. So in that case, if you cannot match into residency with such a substantial amount of debt, you enter a situation where every single year your interest payments on $500,000 will not be able to be kept up with unless you have a physician salary. It is that physician salary that will allow you to pay off heavy interest over long periods of time in some cases, but the real difficulties come for those students that are not able to match into residency, which is why that residency match process could be such a stressful process for a lot of students. Now finally, we've gotten to the part of the video where I'm going to tally up just how much money I've spent so far on my education and will have spent by the time I graduate in May of 2022. I have no problems with doing this for you guys on video here on YouTube. And when it comes down to it, it's going to be a process trying to pay this all back. It's going to be something that I'll most likely document in another video, how I plan to pay things off in residency and afterwards too. So we could start off with the amount of money that I spent on my undergrad education minus the amount of money that I won in scholarships. So in total, for my 5 years of undergrad at Ryerson University, I ended up somewhere around $30,000 Canadian in debt just from my time in undergrad. This is minus $5,000 that I got back in scholarships. Now for medical school, I said that it was around $25,000 per year for 3 years, but in actuality, for the full 3 years, when you include other expenses for the school, my entire medical education will most likely cost me somewhere around $80,000 for my 3-year education. Now, out of all the money that I will be spending on school, in Ontario anyways, with our OSAP that we have in place by the government, if your family makes less than a certain amount of money every single year, and then eventually when you are an independent, if you make less than a certain amount of money every single year, you're also given grants that you don't need to pay back to help you as a student afford education, which means that approximately 15% of all the money that I've taken out as a grant will not have to be paid back. So out of the about $110,000, I most likely will not have to be paying back about 15% of that. And then finally, after all of the expenses and everything have been combined, I've done the math, I'll have it up on the screen somewhere. I've also won a few scholarships being here in medical school. I've gotten a few grants now, especially in the last year. We're getting a little bit of money because we're working in the hospital and it helps us pay for things. So in total, when I add everything up, we get a grand total to be paid back starting as soon as possible of $160,000 in student loans by the time that I graduate. And that is something that I'm going to pay back as quickly as possible once I get started with residency. The plan is for me to live as a medical student all throughout residency. And then when I become an attending, to live as a resident for the first 2 years that I'm an attending. That's the advice that everyone gives to students all the time. And until then, just try your best to manage your money. But I hope this video has been informative for you guys. Hope it's taught you a little bit about the whole financial situation, about being a medical student, and helped you make some informed decisions moving forward. And if you guys have any questions, I will be answering them in the comment section below. I will see you all in the next one. Everyone, take care.